JBS presents the Hampton Synagogue's Author Discussion Series with Rabbi Avraham Bronstein.
Good evening, everyone. In 1977, Dan Glickman became the first Jewish congressman to represent the state of Kansas. As a grandson of immigrants from Russia and Eastern Europe, Glickman's career in public service has taken him from Wichita to Washington to Hollywood and finally to the Hampton Synagogue. Glickman, a 9-term congressman representing the 4th Congressional District of Kansas, served on the Agricultural Committee as a voice for the Kansas farming community. Post-Congress, he became the first Jewish Secretary of Agriculture, serving under President Clinton from 1995 to 2001. He then went on to become the director of Harvard University's School of Government and Institute of Politics. Post-Harvard, he worked at a number of think tanks, national nonprofits, and as chairman and CEO of the Motion Picture Association of America. Currently, Dan Glickman is a senior fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center, an adjunct professor of agriculture and nutrition at Tufts University, and a board member of the World Food Program. Tonight, he'll be discussing his book, Laughing at Myself, My Education in Congress, the Farm, and at the Movies. James Carville said, "It's been Dan's wit and wisdom that has taken him from Wichita to Washington, but it has also been his decency, his ability to work across political spectrums, and his awareness and ability to understand the power of humor to diffuse, distract, and delight." Secretary Glickman, thank you for bringing your wit, your wisdom, and your decency to the Hampton Synagogue.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good evening.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Glenn, for the introduction. We wrote it this morning, and you did perfectly.
Okay, first question, very basic question. As Glenn mentioned in the introduction, the title of your book is Laughing at Myself. And over the course of the book, there's so much about the role of political humor. Not just political humor, just good humor in general. Half the book, a good percentage of the book, is just dad jokes that you heard, that you developed, different jokes and funny stories that came back and forth. So maybe you can spend a few minutes just telling us your theory of political humor and why political humor is so important.
Okay, well, first of all, thanks for inviting me. Thanks to Mark Schneier for having me. Thanks to the Mona Rickless, Ackerman, Ari Ackerman, the entire Ackerman family for their friendship over the years, and especially to my wife, Mona, because Rhoda and Mona were sorority sisters at the University of Michigan. I won't say when, but it's probably before a few people were born in this room, but not everybody. I can look around. Go Blue is right. Jerry was from the same thing. So anyway, I'm delighted to be here. So I guess, my grandfather came from Belarus and ended up from Cleveland and Boston and then Kansas City and Wichita, and he's peddled rags and went in the scrap iron business. And he was once asked, well, you were an early settler in this state. And he said, yeah, I settled for 10 cents on the dollar. And the truth is that humor was very much a part of the life of my grandparents and my parents, both parents. And I wrote this book largely because I think that we've become a humorless society. Politics especially is devoid of humor. There were a few people, talk a lot about a mentor of mine, Bob Dole, a Republican, who was a close friend and ally and felt that humor was a way to kind of bring people together and make you likable. And if you're likable and they liked you, they might do what you want them to do. But what's happened in American society today is our politics have become brutal, caustic, and humorless. overall. And I thought, well, I'd write this book to talk about my own experiences. And most of them came from my family, the culture and the shtick, growing up Jewish in small town America, and especially being the first Secretary of Agriculture since Joseph served the Pharaoh, long time ago. I don't remember it exactly, but, and by the way, if you look at the Bible, a lot of those agriculture principles, the 6 years on and 1 year off, 7 years, that's all basically true today in terms of how we till the soil and plant our crops. So anyway, nothing's changed, I guess.
Nothing's changed.
Nothing changes, yeah.
And it's so interesting because reading the book, I noticed that it's very different from a lot of other political books or political memoirs because there's much less focus on policy or concrete achievements, the numbers, the X's and the O's. I accomplished this, or I wanted the tax rate to be that high, or I was pushing for this particular program and I did it in this way. There's much less emphasis on that, and there's much more emphasis on the relationships that you were able to cultivate and the people that you were able to interact with, or the jokes that you were able to tell, and the funny anecdotes that came up along the way. And I'm wondering if that was an intentional way that you're telling this story, or maybe, let's say a generation ago, politics was actually more like that, and that's just the way that things were before something happened.
That's a good question. I think both are true. I think politics was more like that 30, 40, 50 years ago. Money in politics was less of a factor. Most members of Congress now spend 80% of their time raising money. I'll give you one idea that when I ran for Congress in 1976 against a Republican incumbent congressman, I spent a total of $100,000 on the race, primary and general.
Wow.
Today they're spending $100,000 a day, maybe more. And so that makes life a lot different in terms of how you do your job and how you think about your job. But there was more collaboration, collegiality back then. It wasn't perfect. There were always issues because it's politics. It's meant to be a kind of a spirited sport anyway. The other thing is I was a middle child, as is my wife Rhoda. And middle children tend to, I'm overstating it, but there's a tendency to want to work things out. You want to achieve peace and conciliation where you can. Doesn't mean you don't have strong principles, but I think that that was kind of inbred in my genes to be a collaborative spirit, not to be charging the light brigade every chance. And now almost every person in politics is charging, if not the light brigade, the camera. It's a different world than it used to be.
I noticed also the other major trend in your book is first the role of political humor, and second your career as a political moderate. Right? You wear that banner very, very proudly.
Yes.
That you were a moderate. Do those two things naturally go together, or are they two separate things that you were able to kind of blend?
I don't know. I've just always been a moderate. I just have always resisted people who are up in between the end zone and the 20-yard line on either side. It drives me nuts because nothing gets done there. It always gets done between the 40-yard line and the 40-yard line. A little bit to the left, a little bit to the right. And also I was at Kansas. I was a Democrat from Kansas. Well, this is not like being a Democrat in New York, to be honest with you. I had to be not that people aren't thoughtful in Congress here. Please tell Carolyn Maloney I was not saying that she wasn't thoughtful. But the truth is that you had to listen to both sides all the time. That the district was more conservative. The state was more conservative. So, if I were too far to the left, I wouldn't get reelected and I couldn't get anything done. Mm-hmm. And then the third thing was, there's a kind of a poster engraved above the speaker's chair in the House of Representatives from Daniel Webster, and he says, "Let us go forth and lead the land we love, but always remember to do things worthy to be remembered." Worthy to be remembered. And that I used to walk into the House, not that I was anything special, and look at that and think to myself, it's such a great privilege to be here, a Jewish kid, son of Eastern immigrants, being in Congress, and then of course it was in spades when I got to be Secretary of Agriculture. But the whole idea in being in government is to do things. And today we are kind of in a perpetual battle.
Mm-hmm. And things don't get done.
Pardon?
And things don't get done.
Some things do, but the big things don't get done. That's the problem. Small things still get done. A member of Congress can still work for his or her constituents and work on their problems, Social Security, Medicare, take care of that. Sometimes, when there's a flood or a natural disaster, or, they tend to get done. But big things in terms of making profound change in our country, doing that kind of thing, it's really hard to do.
So when you look back, what would be like an example that comes to mind for you of something that you were able to get done, or something that got done then that wouldn't be able to get done nowadays?
Well, it's an example in the field of agriculture, food, and nutrition. The United States is fortunate that we have the most developed anti-hunger programs in the world in the United States. We have a food stamp program, or called a SNAP program, that costs about $1 trillion over 10 years. And we have school meals programs, and we have the WIC program. And those were all authorized through the Agriculture Committee, on which I served. And I was able to participate in that and bring conservative farmers together with urban folks who aren't necessarily so conservative to basically create a strong policy for farm interests, but also to try to help the poor and hungry in this country. And it's an example of a very amazing success that we haven't had in many other areas. So I participated in that. I was always very proud of it.
Do you think that because of this is a little bit afield from the last question?
Yeah.
It sparked a question, so it's not on the card, it's a tangent.
Okay.
Do you think that your Jewish identity, kind of being a little bit of an outsider in Kansas, is what also allowed you to be able to reach across geographic divides, urban-rural divides, and make some of those connections that somebody else coming from Kansas in the Agriculture Committee wouldn't have been able to make?
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, I don't think there's any question that my being Jewish had a big factor in my thought processes. I probably was more conservative on a lot of policy issues than a lot of Jewish folks who came from urban areas, or just because of the nature of the business I was in, urban versus rural, and that kind of thing. But I was not only always being very proud being Jewish, but in some sense, and this is not meant to metaphorically raise me to excessively high levels, but I used to think that I was placed in this job to kind of be a spokesman for the faith. Mm-hmm. And if not for the faith, to at least show that we were
representing.
We were okay people, we were pretty good people. And what I learned, I'll never forget, just a couple of anecdotes. There was a period in the late 70s where they had a group called the Posse Comitatus. It's very much like the Proud Boys today, except they were mostly in rural America. And so I was very involved in farm issues, and there was a lot of anti-Semitism in this area. And so that one of them was interviewed on TV back in the late 70s, and they were asked, and they said, well, they think that outsiders, Eastern influences, were cause of all of our problems. And the reporter says, well, do you mean Jewish influences? He says, well, they're part of it. And so the reporter says, well, your congressman, Glickman, is a Jew. And he says, yeah, but he's not a Zionist. And thank you for a strange favor, so to speak. But what that taught me a little bit was not so much about Zionism, but it taught me they kind of liked me. They thought I spoke to them and was doing a good job, so they were trying to differentiate me from the stereotype, those guys that were there. And I think a lot of that came from my parents. My parents would talk to anybody. It didn't matter if they were the poorest people on the earth or the richest people were there. They would absolutely talk to everybody, and they would befriend everybody. And my dad owned a AAA baseball team in Wichita, the Wichita Arrows, and we were affiliated with Chicago Cubs. They were the worst team in baseball at the time. I mean, Ari doesn't know about the worst teams in baseball, but this was a team that was so bad that when one of the second basemen would bunt successfully, they'd call him up to Chicago because, they figured like they had a success on their hands. And my dad loved that team, and he used to bring in the whole town into the games, and he would pay for them and everything else. he was kind of like a master of ceremonies for the town. But I learned from him, and my mother also had this wonderful wit, that in fact you could win a lot of friends by just being a decent human being, and not necessarily what your station of life was, which a lot of us kind of gravitate to, particularly with the nature of power and money in our political system, but try to appreciate the role that average folks have to play.
I want to ask another question that kind of dovetails off the end of your last response.
Yeah.
It's kind of a chicken and egg kind of question.
Well, that's an agriculture question.
It is an agriculture question, exactly. So the question is, do you think that American politics have become more humorless because, for some reason, American politics have become more bitter? Or do you think they've become more bitter because they're becoming more humorless? What have we lost first?
I think they go together. You know, and certainly the last 6 years, I mean, I don't mean to be overly partisan, but the Trump years just created such a pall on our politics in America. And I'm not going to blame it all on Donald Trump, because a lot of this was happening before he got there. And the 24-hour media has had a lot to do with it. C-SPAN, which is great, I love it, but it showed all the defects in everybody's complexion all the time. And so, you know, and the American media today is a lot different than it used to be. You know, growing up, I had 3 television networks to watch, and nothing else. I'd go outside, hit golf balls, play golf. Today, it's with 24-hour television, and most of that television is divisive. Not all, but most of it is. I think that has a lot to do with it. I think the nature of, I mentioned money in politics, because most money is spent to tear down somebody, not to raise somebody up. And, you know, and maybe it's because the problems are more complex today than they used to be. The solutions are harder to come by, and maybe people are irritated and agitated. And, you know, maybe the fact that an awful lot of people don't see the future as very bright, maybe that has something to do with it as well.
It's an interesting thing, because I guess studies have shown that attack ads work, because otherwise they wouldn't do them. Or TV networks that push particular agendas know that a very, very harsh way of presenting the news works because people watch it. So on one end, or even elected officials understand that very harsh rhetoric or extreme positions work because that's what gets them elected.
And that's true, and I've had my share. I'm not saying that I'm a baby pure on these issues. You know, you don't get anywhere in this game of politics without being tough. But at the same time, I'll never forget Hubert Humphrey, and most of you in this room would remember who he was of course, a famous senator and ran for president, was vice president with Lyndon Johnson. But when I was a freshman member of Congress back in November of 1977, so it's almost 50 years ago, he came and spoke to a joint meeting of the House and Senate. It wasn't a joint session of Congress. And he was dying at the time. And he said, just remember this. He says, fight every battle like it's the most important battle you have, and use all your resources. But when you're done, just remember that adversary you're going to need tomorrow, or the day after tomorrow. And so, you know, the people who've achieved great success in our political world are usually those people who don't burn bridges. And one of the best ways to burn bridges is to smile and be likable, and you know, tell a joke once in a while. You can be serious, you can have serious public policy discussions, but not to have a caustic, nasty sense of humor where you don't build those bridges. And the other thing that has to do is the changing nature of our political parties. I'm a Democrat, proud of it, but I'm other things too. I'm American, I'm a Jew, I'm a husband, you know, I'm a father, and I'm a golfer, not a very good one. I have lots of other things that I care about in my life. And today in politics, party identification and party loyalty just trumps, I hate to use that word, but trumps everything. It's really a disturbing situation. And when you go against your party, you're spurned. You know, the Republicans who voted for Biden's infrastructure bill, this is building bridges, roads, sewers, are being vilified because they didn't oppose him because it was him. That's different. The Bob Doles of the world, or the others that I mentioned, were not like that.
So what has to happen to get back to that way of doing things?
If you could figure it out and write a book like this, maybe you'd be you'd make as much as I did out of this book. No, I don't know. I think that the voters have to determine this. I mean, this is not a magic thing that somebody on high is going to decide.
So I guess that's the question, right? Do voters really want it this way?
They say they don't, but remember the old Milton Berle line? Again, some of you don't remember who Milton Berle was, but he was a famous comedian. And we'd go on stage, he won applause, but he would be feign like he didn't want it, so he would go like this, and then he would go like this at the same time. That's a little bit like a lot of our political leaders. But as I said, some of the younger ones actually do have courage and character.
So you're optimistic in the larger sense?
Yeah, I'm realistically optimistic.
Question more about your biography.
Yes.
You obviously, your choice to become part of the Agriculture Committee when you got to Congress was so defining over the course of your career. And you write in the book how that choice to become part of the Agriculture Committee kind of arose out of your decision after you were first elected to Congress and figuring out what path you would take and where you would go to draw very strong connections to the farmers in your district. Right? You said there were some urban areas in your district and there were also some more rural and farmland in your district.
Yes.
And you made the choice to go to the farmers.
Well,
and it turned out to be like a defining choice.
Every congressional district is different, but so my district had a couple of very famous things to it. One, we're the home of Koch Industries, the Koch world. This is a huge world in American politics. Their headquarters, Charles Koch, David Koch, the whole Koch world, who funded much of the conservative infrastructure of this country, is in my district, and the old district. And they've had a lot of impact in that world. But also the aviation capital of the world. Half the airplanes in the world were built in my hometown. Beech, Cessna, Learjet, Boeing, small airplanes. And then you're obviously food and agriculture and everything else. So when I first got to Congress, and I wasn't expected to be elected, I defeated a long-term incumbent Republican congressman. And it was in the post-Watergate era, so I had the benefit of that. And I wanted to go on the Ways and Means Committee. I wanted to go on the Appropriations Committee. And but there's this kid from Kansas, and I wasn't really part of the inside structure. And my chief of staff, who had been my debate teacher in high school, said to me, she says, you go on the Agriculture Committee, you go on the Ways and Means Committee, you may be out of here in 4 years. But you go on the Agriculture Committee and build deep links into the soil, so to speak. You can be around for as long as you want to be. Well, that was kind of true because I got elected in 76 and I got diselected in 1994 in the Gingrich Revolution. But that decision made a big difference in my life because I then became Secretary of Agriculture. Wouldn't have happened, and in the President's cabinet. And then I later became head of the Motion Picture Association of America, in large part because I had been Secretary of Agriculture, cabinet position. So that decision to go down the road of agriculture was a big deal.
So it was one really good bit of very good advice.
It's good advice and a lot of luck too. You never know what's going to happen in your world, but it worked out well.
I'm just curious about those initial meetings that you, the Jewish congressman recently elected, had with these farmers outside Wichita.
We didn't have a lot of them with the Jewish members of Congress, but I remember I used to deal a fair amount.
I'm talking more about you, meaning it's when you first went out.
Oh, when I went out there, yeah. First of all, they knew my dad because my dad was in the scrap iron business and in the oil business, and so he had to buy oil and gas leases from farmers. And he would tell them jokes, I told the jokes, and he would tell these jokes over and over again. It drove my mother crazy. He used to tell this joke to us, but then he would tell it to other people. He says, your mother and I have sex almost every night. Or he would say it in front of other people. My wife and I have sex almost every night. And people would say, really? Yeah. Almost on Monday, almost on Tuesday, almost on Wednesday. And you would get these jokes. It was, my mother, crazy. They asked her if she'd ever thought of divorce. She says, no, murder, yes. And she was funny in her own way. And he was Rodney Dangerfield and Henny Youngman, all put together. And so what he did is the farmers liked him. And so I learned I used to go out and watched him. And, when you talk to farmers, oftentimes they're reticent and they're not like necessarily you and I or you talked. I'm overstating it a bit. And so my dad learned how to reach them and how to make them like him and how to make them, because he'd want to get their leases. They want to get the land rights to drill wells or buy scrap iron. And so I learned a lot, and also it got me to understand their problems. It's probably the most difficult job in the world when you think about it, is being a farmer, you know, subject to the whims of the weather and pricing that you can't control yourselves. And so anyway, I think that I found it, I didn't find it all that difficult to be with them. But, you know, being Jewish was kind of an interesting thing, because many times being Jewish came up in my career. I told one story, but there was the other story. I went to, when I first got to be Secretary of Agriculture, I went to Lubbock, Texas, West Texas. I don't know if anybody's ever been to Lubbock. Okay, you've been to Lubbock. All right. So it's where Buddy Holly was from. They got this big statue of Buddy Holly when you come near the airport, when you come into town. And so it had been a terrible drought, like they're having right now in the West, and it hadn't rained for a long time. But I liked the weather, and I took some courses in meteorology in college, and the weather always interested in me, and I could see that rain was coming. So I said, I think you're going to get rain soon. So anyway, that night, they had 3 inches of rain in Lubbock. And the next morning, the county commission met me at the Best Western Hotel in Lubbock, where I was staying. And a woman came up to me, and she says, "Now I know why they call you the chosen people." And I used to have people come up to me and say, one woman came up and says, "You know, I'm one of you." And I said, I knew what she meant. And I said, "Well, what do you mean you're one of me?" And she says, "Well, we share so much." And I said, "Well, what is it that we share?" And finally she says, "We share the same faith," but said it in a whisper, you know. I don't think she was as religious as I was in that world. But, you know, there were other incidences that when I went to the state fair in Iowa, and if you go to any of these state fairs during political years, especially in Iowa, it's a big deal. So I went there, and I was a guest of the Iowa Pork Producers Association. Bill Clinton used to say, he said, "What a country that you could have the first Jewish Secretary of Agriculture promoting the pork industry." He really liked that. So anyway, I went there to the Iowa Pork Producers and sat down, and several hundred people in the crowd, and they served the biggest, giant pork chop I'd ever seen. And I'm no expert on pork chops, and I do try to avoid eating pork chops. I want you to know that. And but sometimes when you're in politics, it can't be an absolute. But anyway, so I just let it sit there, and the waiter came and took the plate away from me, and he was very nice. The Iowa Cattlemen's Association was right next door. And so he brought over a steak from the Iowa Cattlemen, and I said, "Thank you very much." And then the waiter from the pork producers took the steak away and brought a pork chop back. And yelling on the side of his voice, he says, "I told you he doesn't eat pork." And in the meantime, 3,000 years of anxiety starts sweating my head. And there's a reporter from the Des Moines Register across from me who says, "Why don't you eat pork?" And I was thinking to myself, "You are the dumbest SOB I think I've ever met," but I didn't say it. And anyway, it's cute kind of stories, you know,
exactly.
that come up.
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
Here, one last question from me, and the question is, it's a simple one. When somebody reads your book, what message or what lessons do you want them to walk away with?
One is just like it, relax. You know, it's a little less serious than, you know, and two, hopefully they'll find it as an antidote to the kind of caustic politics of today. And then the third thing is something my mother and others have said, you know, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a simple reason. People have not learned the skill of listening anymore. They learn the skill of talking and listening only to things that reinforce their historic or pre-existing views. And, you know, I just like to think that one of the things that made our country great are people of different backgrounds, different perspectives that could learn to cooperate and reach some sort of consensus with each other. And, you know, maybe the art of listening is one of the other lessons that I would do. So.
Dan Glickman, thank you so much.
All right, okay. Sure.